Hello, this is Barbara Colm, and I have the pleasure to have David Herbert here with me. David and I go back, I
Few
think,
years
a
now,
few
yeah.
years now.
Yeah.
We've been sitting together on panels, have been discussing not only trade, monetary policy, ESG, and all kinds of stuff, but most importantly, Dave, thank you very much for taking the time.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. So Dave is a senior research fellow in research and education at AIER now, but he has a PhD in economics. He's been a senior fellow at many other institutions as well.
Yeah.
And you've been a professor
Yeah.
at which university? The most recent one?
Most recently, I was at Aquinas College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, just down the road from the Acton Institute,
Yeah.
which is where you and I first met.
Exactly,
So,
yes.
Yeah. Yep.
But don't tell how many years ago.
Not that many. Yes. Very fair. Very few.
But what actually brought you into this field of economics and into the field of uh, freedom-loving individuals?
Yeah. So I went to Hillsdale College, and it was just a great experience there. I got to meet lots of wonderful
Yes,
people,
yeah.
right? And I just fell in love with economics and what it could show you about the world and how everything kind of works. How is it that, in a world where you have billions of people, there's bound to be conflict, right? And so you want to find a peaceful way to resolve those conflicts. You don't want to just have people thumping around or, thumping each other on the head all day. So how can you peacefully, avoid conflict or deal with conflict? And markets are an incredibly powerful device to do that, right? And it doesn't require violence at all. There's no hurting. There's actually just peaceful cooperation and working together to figure out how can we live better together. And so that was my real draw into economics as a field. And then you start looking into, okay, so how do we sort of manage conflict in other areas, right? And sometimes there are people that will call and say, hey, we need to use government to do this, right? As if, writing down on a piece of paper called legislation will just make the problem go away. And you see, it's like, okay, I can see the logic, right? I can see what you're saying. And then you look at, the history of the solutions and what's happened, and none of it turns out well. And so then you start saying like, okay, well, there must be some reason for this, right? There must be a reason why, the best of intentions, because I do fundamentally think that most, maybe not all, but most elected officials do want to do good. It's just they're not capable of it. They don't have the knowledge or the incentives necessary to do it. And so that was what led me to then, Austrian economics and public choice, understanding both the epistemic and the incentive constraints that elected officials face. And now all of a sudden, there's these theories that explain government failure. And there's a theory in economics of how people could work together. And that's sort of how I got into this free market or open society way of approaching economics.
Well, you mentioned two things: the knowledge problem on the one hand, and also methodological individualism by Hayek, both actually by Hayek. So can you elaborate a little bit about the knowledge problem, what this is, and why we need to look into that there is no such thing as full information?
Yeah. So the knowledge problem, what it deals with is how do people come to know the necessary information that they would need to know in order to affect any sort of change. So there was a great debate in the socialist calculation debate in the early 1900s, which is fascinating to read if you haven't done so already, where we look at these prices as if they were mere numbers, right? And computers can come up with numbers.
Yeah.
I do it all the time. I use Excel. Yeah, it happens, right? And so if prices are mere numbers, then all you need to do is calculate them, right? That's easy. You have arithmetic for that, right? And so that seems like an attractive way of thinking,
But
right?
they miss something.
But they miss something. And the process of generating those numbers isn't done on a computer. It's not done in a spreadsheet. It's done with you and I and millions upon millions of other people interacting in a organized fashion, right? Not organized through any sort of external means, but through competitive, bids and asks and just interactions and seeing kind of what we want, what we don't want, what we like, what we don't like. And all of that information, which is subjective. It's the phrase is, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
So the beautiful thing about prices is it's an objective number, right? Like the coffee costs $5. That's an objective thing. but the $5 represents the underlying subjective values of millions of people. So the price mechanism is a means of transforming subjective valuations that are held by millions of people that aren't really explicitly communicated to anyone ever into an objective thing called a price. And now we can use that price as the basis for future decisions. So that's the idea, is that the knowledge necessary to generate that price cannot possibly be held by one person or even one group of people. It's held by all of us, and we have to interact to have those prices actually emerge. The idea that we could just discover them outside the market context is false. Those prices don't exist outside the market context.
Well, and then you also mentioned something, subjective value. And
Yeah.
there we have another great Austrian economist, actually
Yeah.
the father of the
Yeah.
Austrian economist, Karl Menger.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
what did Karl Menger tell us about the subjective values?
Yeah, so Karl Menger in his Principles textbook is just a wonderful read. It's available for free online. If you haven't found it at the time to read it,
You can
absolutely
buy it
should.
at the Hayek Institute.
You can also buy it at the Hayek Institute and support
at the
everyone-
Austrian Economic Center.
you can support all those places. And so it's a wonderful book, and everyone should absolutely read it. And the idea behind subjective value is quite simple. So my daughter, she's 2, right? She loves ketchup. She wants to put ketchup on everything. Okay, and that's fine. She wants to do that. That's her prerogative, right? I find ketchup to be absolutely abhorrent. I cannot stand it. I think it should just go away, right? And that's fine too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in a world where the ketchup exists, right? My daughter thinks it's the greatest thing ever. Now she's only 2 years old, so there's few
she
things
might
she's
change her
experienced.
mind.
Fingers crossed, right? But me, I don't like it at all. So we would need some way to take the fact that my 2-year-old daughter loves ketchup and me, 37-year-old Dave, does not like ketchup, right? And somehow combine that information. Like, how much does Dave dislike ketchup? Turns out a lot, right? How much though? I don't know. And so the idea behind subjective preferences is that is actually like who we are. We are these people that have these subjective values and these subjective preferences, right? And that's who we are. There's not an objective measure of how valuable, for example, ketchup is. Now, ketchup is a trivial example, sure, but the idea behind that is that it applies to everything, right? Every valuation that everyone has to be subjective. Beauty is, as we said earlier, in the eye of the beholder.
That is true. So let's shift gears.
Okay.
Go away a little bit from the Austrian economics, from Hayek and from Menger, Mises, etc. But let's go back to the social philosopher and French law person, Frederick Bastiat,
Yeah.
who mentioned when goods cross borders, weapons won't.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about free trade and about trade in general.
Yeah.
Do we have free trade at all?
Sorry.
We can cut this out.
Thank you.
So, do we have free trade at all, Dave? How or do we have only managed trade? And what about all this protectionist tendencies these days?
Yeah. So I think the best quote on this it comes from Milton Friedman. He said, "Look, if you have a free trade agreement that's longer than one page, it's not free trade." Okay. And a sad reality is that every country in the world has free trade agreements with other nations and other groups of nations, and they're all much longer than one page. And so there's got to be some weird stuff in there to get it to beyond a page, right? I don't need a free trade agreement with the grocery store. I just go over there and buy it. I don't think about the international diplomacy issues or whatever, right? And so if you've got something that's longer than a page, there's got to be some wheeling and dealing going on in there. And that makes it, at best, managed trade, but at worst, very unfree trade. And this is something that we see on both the left and the right to similar degrees, but with different sort of flavorings. So we see different protectionist policies implemented by the right than we do from the left, but they're both fundamentally not free traders.
So what are the benefits of free trade?
Yeah, so the benefits are legion at some level. So, first and foremost, we all get better access to goods and services that other nations are able to produce because of their unique capabilities and their unique geographies or their unique situations.
In other words, the prices for us consumers will be cheaper.
Will fall, yeah, exactly. So at the end of the day, one of the things that I'm really concerned with as an economist is getting goods and services into the hands of people at the lowest price. Right? If we can increase the access and affordability of everything, that sounds like a great policy.
And then we can spend the money on other things.
And then we can spend the money on other things.
Or
we can
save it.
We can save it for the future and increase productivity then. Right? There's a million things you can do if prices come down. Right? And so that's one benefit. The other benefit is with increased specialization, we can all find special ways to serve in a hyper specialized way that matches sort of what we're interested in. So my dad is a great example of this. He worked for a screw manufacturing company. All he did was make screws, right? High precision screws, like the ones in your watch or your glasses, right? Well, think about that. That's all his company did, right? He just made screws. We've never had something of a division of labor that extensive in all of human history. And so there's that aspect. But the other aspect is the civilizing aspect. You don't typically find people upset at their grocer, the person that they buy their food from. They generally like that person because they find value in the goods and services that the grocery store provides. What we also see is something similar. When countries are trading with one another, because trade, when it's voluntary, has to be mutually beneficial. I win and you win, right? We don't want to jeopardize that. Why would I want to get rid of a winning thing that's making me better off? I don't want to harm that relationship. And so when you have goods and services crossing borders, bullets and weapons and munitions tend not to, right? Because you're now friends. So trade is at some level a humanizing, a civilizing. The idea behind economics really is bringing into the household, right? It is making friends of strangers. And that's fundamentally what economic life is all about, is finding ways to transform a stranger into a friend.
And creating added value.
And creating added value. Yeah, exactly.
But this is also true for nations.
Yes.
So we can put this from the individual level to the local level, the national level, but importantly also for supranational levels. The national level would be of interest to me now. So what can we do, and you would mention public choice beforehand, to make sure that people understand that if we want to create added value, we need to cooperate, we don't need to be protectionist, we need to keep our borders open for trade and also people coming into our countries.
Right. Well, I think that's the big thing. The biggest issue to me in today's world is trying to figure out, how can we make sure that goods and services and people are crossing borders and bullets aren't, right? And so one thing we can really get at is to think about, do we have free trade? What's stopping me from purchasing something in a different country, right? A lot of times it's tariffs, a lot of times it's quotas, a lot of times it's just simple regulations. It could even be subsidies for domestic industries. And so the logic is pretty, I think, pretty clear for the would-be protectionists, right? They want to promote, domestic industry. We saw this with steel and aluminum tariffs a few years ago, right? And so if you look into, how many people work in the steel and aluminum industry in the U.S.? It's about 0.002% of the population, right? Okay, so those people benefit from having more sales, more wages, whatever, right? The rest of us, though, pay much higher prices for anything and everything involving steel and aluminum. And so the 99.9998% of us are costed significantly, right? And not by just a little bit. It's actually like fundamentally changing how companies are producing the things that they're making in order to avoid using steel and aluminum, because those are now more expensive. So what I think we should do is really consider, like, will this help the consumer? Right, because at some level, most of our daily life is spent at work at some level. That's true, but most of our economic life is consuming, right? So I produce economics articles and economics videos. Cool, that's two things or one thing that I make, right? I consume a lot more than two things, right? And so I want to consider.
I'm sure you also consume your colleagues' articles.
Yeah, I do, of course I do,
and
right?
your colleagues' podcasts.
Of course I do, but I want to focus on is how can I make it better for the hundreds of things that I use on a day-to-day basis? How can I make those things cheaper rather than trying to just make my one thing a little bit more expensive?
Let's have a look at, if we talk about those things. There is people who think that sanctions and protectionism is important these days. Let's first talk about sanctions.
Yeah.
And there's a famous quote by Keynes when he said in 1924, I think, in the aftermath of World War One, when sanctions were imposed on certain countries, he said, "Well, sanctions don't work. They only harm those people who they are not meant for, and in general, it costs more than the benefit is."
Right.
So, what is your take on that? And
Yeah, so I have a really hard time with economic sanctions. On the one hand, I want to be sympathetic to the idea that people who do horrible things in the world, there needs to be some sort of a punishment for, that bad action. And I am reminded of the Russia-Ukraine war. Okay, so we want to punish Putin and Russia for engaging in an unjust war against the Ukrainian people. Okay, so economic sanctions seems like a pretty straightforward answer. But this is where I think the Austrian insight comes into play, and you start thinking about, well, who has the decision-making authority for war in Russia? Well, that's Putin and his inner circle, right? The people that are extraordinarily wealthy.
Yeah.
If we impose economic sanctions on Russia, well, Putin's not going to wonder if he's going to be able to heat his house at night,
Yeah.
or if he's going to have bread on the table or food in the kitchen or anything like that. He's going to be just fine.
Yeah.
It's the ordinary Russian citizens who are going to feel the cost of the economic sanctions. And these are the people that, if you look at the polling data, a lot of them don't support the war at all. And so now we're punishing them for Putin's transgressions. And so I'm reticent to recommend sanctions. They tend to not work. They tend to, at some level, even galvanize the nation against the sanctioning country. So in the case of Russia, the Russian people, after the economic sanctions are passed, were galvanized around Putin even more.
Yeah.
And so what we see empirically and historically is that when we use economic sanctions to try to end wars faster, they end up extending the war longer. So I have a really hard time with economic sanctions. The sentiment is there. I can see the intent. It's just the execution. And it's not even just like, if we did it smart, it would be better. It's the idea itself actually doesn't work as well as we want it to.
Yeah.
In fact, it oftentimes works in the opposite way than we want it to.
Are there alternatives to that? Apart
So-
from keeping peace?
Yeah, apart from peacekeeping, the big one for me has always been asylum. So it's always interesting to me when we have restrictions, and this comes back to the opening borders and letting people come in. If your country is suffering and you need to leave, you should be able to.
Yeah.
It seems pretty straightforward. But the U.S. and other nations will say, well, we'll allow a couple thousand, asylum seekers in. Why? We have plenty of space in the U.S. I mean, I don't know if you've been to Wyoming, but there's lots of space there, right? But there's lots of space in plenty of places. And so it's not a space issue. And so I struggle with that. It's like, what is the limiting factor? Why can't, if you agree to 2,000, what's wrong with 3,000?
Yeah.
What's wrong with 10? What's wrong with 100,000? Right? I've never really gotten a good answer to that number, and where you come up with that number, like that limiting cap. And that's, I think, what we should do, is extending, the humanitarian help to the best of our ability, at least, but also opening the borders and letting people come in and seek refuge and safety.
Yeah. One thing on that front, I mean, apart from, the asylum seekers, for the refugees, but I'm pro open borders for people who integrate, who contribute to the labor force, to the working force, who work and are integrated into our societies, want to be integrated and want to integrate themselves, actually, put it that way.
Yeah.
What models have you seen across the world, so whether it's the Canadian model that works best, or whether it's the model in the United States, or that is or what we do in Europe? What do you think works best in that case?
Yeah, that's really hard to say, because a lot of them are going to be context specific, depending on the nature of the situation at hand. How extreme is it? How long is it projected to last? What is the underlying sentiment of the people in the country that refugees are seeking to enter? A lot of it depends on so much there. So I'm a little reticent to say this is best, this is what we should all do. At the end of the day, I think we should err on the side of letting too many people into countries than too few.
Okay, well, I have one final question.
Sure.
What books would you recommend to people who want to learn more, not only about AIER and about what you research and what you do, but who are interested in general in freedom, in individual and entrepreneurial freedom, in free markets, and the things that we keep defending.
Yep.
So, what would you recommend?
So I always recommend Frederick Bastiat. There's a wonderful three-part series of his collected works. That's just a gold mine for just great analysis, great insights. Yes, it's a couple hundred, almost 200 years old now, but it is 200-year-olds good. So I can't recommend Bastiat enough. Next would be Friedrich Hayek. I just think he's absolutely a wonderful thinker. It's also interesting and fun to see the evolution of his thought over his career. So Bruce Caldwell has some great books on Hayek's autobiography. And then the last one that I think I would recommend to most people that may not be on people's list would be the collected works of Armin Alchian. So Armin Alchian is he's not necessarily an Austrian economist. He's not necessarily that, but he's a UCLA economist, and he's just so wonderful. And his ability to explain things very clearly and very succinctly is at some level unmatched.
Well, thank you, Dave, for first of all taking the time, for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us. And I'm looking forward to further discussions and hopefully at the Free Market Roadshow next year, whether it's in the US or in Europe, to be on the same panels and have you back.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.